Hi, we continue in 1 Samuel 17 today after David has convinced Saul that his experience killing lions and bears in defense of his sheep is sufficient to have him go up against Goliath. But before David goes, Saul is going to try to clothe him in some armor, which David will reject, and then we'll see the two champions taunting each other before the battle starts. So before we jump in, just a couple of things about the shape of the passage we've been looking at here. So we've been looking throughout the entire chapter, as you see on the right side of the screen, at this rough chiastic shape of the whole story. And one of the reasons that the C part is doubled here is that chapter 17 has parts that are in the Hebrew Bible and parts that are in the Septuagint that don't completely overlap, as we've been looking at. So the bold parts here are the parts that are in the Hebrew but not in the Greek. So we went through that whole section and we picked up here last time. And one of the issues is that if we read the Greek without the Hebrew, the story reads differently. We don't have the whole part either about David and his family, nor do we have David knowing there's a reward for whoever kills David. He comes out looking much more like someone who's just serving the king and serving the people. In our passage today, there's also a verse right here that's in the Hebrew that's not in the Septuagint, so we'll look at that again as we go. And I've also shaped the section here across the chiasm that I just showed you, first with the part with David and Saul at the beginning, and then this other chiasm with David and Goliath together from 40 to 50. We're only going to cover through verse 47 today. But then the center of that chiasm is its own little chiasm. So we'll look at that a little more as we go, but just to see the big picture of it, you can see in the A part, it refers to the classic 5 smooth stones and David's shepherd bag in his sling, and we see his bag and the stones in the sling down here, but not in the center part. Then the B here, we see the Philistine came and drew near to David, and the B prime part, we see it almost identical. And then the C part is the mutual cursing, and it's a C and a C1, just as the larger chiasm of the chapter is, because here it's plain the Philistine curses David, and then David taunts the Philistine. And then each of them does it in the name of their gods. The narrator tells us that the Philistine does it just generically by his gods, and we hear David out loud in the name of Yahweh, many times in here in the name of Yahweh. We also see the parallels that Philistine taunts him with, I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the field, and David says the same thing, except more broadly, I will give the dead bodies of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the wild animals of the field, so everyone will know there's a God in Israel. But then this little part of David's is its own little chiasm. So you see it starts here with the name of Yahweh of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, and ends with the battle is Yahweh's. Then the B parts are this very day, repeated twice, and in the center is I will strike you down and cut off your head. So they've structured this battle chiastically and then internally chiastically. And if we were to visualize it, it might be very similar as they stand on opposite sides of the mountain with the valley in the middle and approach each other and approach each other, and eventually the battle will take place. So let's scroll up to this part as we move into the first section here of our passage for today with Saul and David. A couple important things here. As Brueggemann notes, the very proposition of clothing with armor is like the nations indeed, Goliath not only not as good at it. I read that wrongly from Brueggemann. Brueggemann's point is that Saul is trying to clothe David like Goliath, but he's not as good at it. As Falkman notes, Saul here is unconsciously already wrestling with the rival, while consciously he thinks he is acting as a supporter. And then also from Falkman, an account of weaponry in order to ridicule and unmask weapon fetishism. And that's an interesting approach to this because certainly throughout the ages, and certainly in our time, as I'm making this video, the U.S. is supporting Ukraine in its battle against Russia, and European allies all go along around the table under the U.S. leadership to decide which weapons they will provide, and that has to do with their strength, etc. So weapon fetishism is not something just from the ancient world, like so many parts of the story, which might not be identical with our world, but express themes that we see equally today. So Saul is literally trying to clothe David, and throughout the Bible, but especially in Deuteronomistic history, clothing expresses a lot about who people are. And so Saul is trying to clothe David with his armor. And we can see that symbolically as he's trying to make David into a version of himself. And this is really a criticism of Saul, because Saul ought to put on his own armor and as king and defend the people himself, as Josiah did, even though Josiah died, and as David will do many times, although once he's king in Jerusalem, we'll see he has his own people to do it for him, which is not a compliment, which is an implicit criticism of him. We'll see it then. So Saul's cowardice is at work here, but he's implicitly implicitly suggesting, well, David could be a substitute for him with his armor and his bronze helmet and his coat of mail. And then we need to ask, where did those come from? As we looked at the beginning of the chapter in some detail on a video on the picture of Goliath, these were all foreign objects, whether defensive or weapons. The helmet and the coat of mail are obviously defensive, but not known to Israel. They were known to the mercenaries in later centuries that were various sea peoples, whether those are Philistines or Greeks or others. But in addition to that, the text has told us earlier on that they were not allowed to have these things because the Philistines controlled metallurgy and sharpening. Let's go back and look at that in 13:19. There was no smith to be found throughout the land of Israel, for the Philistines said the Hebrews must not make swords or spears for themselves. So the Israelites went down to the Philistines to sharpen their plowshares, mattocks, axes, and sickles, which is to say their farm implement. But on the day of battle, neither sword nor spear was to be found in the possession of any of the people. So when we go back here, although there's not sword immediately stated here, that it will be momentarily, we have to wonder where Saul's gotten these metal things from and why he's using what seem to be foreign tools of defensive war. And yet, as it happens, David can't use them. So we see here, as my note below says, David cannot walk in Saul's armor. His type of warfare, at least at first, requires a new approach. But as we'll see later, David can certainly wear a sword. His strapping on Saul's sword here is echoes later his strapping on his sword another time. But here's Saul's sword, explicitly contrary to 13:19, as I was just saying. And then we hear a clearly symbolic description. He tried in vain to walk. And the word here, which can't really pronounce without vowels, usually means to curse. But in the hiphil form here, it can mean an attempt to do something. He tried in vain to walk, but the issue is he was not used to them. Notice the issue isn't that they're too heavy for them or that he doesn't know how in some way. He's just not used to them. Literally, the word here, lonisa, means there's not tested. He hasn't tried them before. And it's twice in the verse. Once in the narrator's mouth, and then David repeats it exactly out of what the narrator said. So he's not used to them. This is not something he's tested, and he's not going to test them now. He cannot walk with these is also a double entendre, at least, to walk literally, to walk toward Goliath and in battle. But throughout the Hebrew Bible, to walk expresses what we might call one's journey, one's way of life, one's choice of how to live. And so David's way of living will not be with armor. And again, it repeats, he's not used to it. So David removed them, literally turned them aside. And so he will not be clothed with Saul. And as we've been seeing throughout this section, the movement, especially in the part that we saw here from the Hebrew, from this part here from the Hebrew Bible, was highlighting his moving away from his father Jesse and the antagonism with his brother Eliab here, who angrily challenged David for even being at the battlefront, and the question of whether he was moving closer to Saul as his father. But as he gets close to Saul, he refuses to be clothed in Saul's outfit. And we'll see in the next chapter, he'll quickly become best friends with Jonathan, which will lead Saul to be angry at both of them for Jonathan siding with David, who he now will come to see as a rival. So perhaps David already recognizing that Saul is dangerous, whether or not we understand that David in chapter 17 is familiar with the evil spirit that was in Saul, that David had been hired as a musician to help relieve. And again, that's part of the question of whether we read the narrative context as including all three of the introductory David stories that we looked at starting in the beginning of chapter 16 and have been working with ever since. So he takes those off, and that moves us into the chiasm for our section here. And we get to the most famous parts of the story. He took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones. If you search for 5 smooth stones, you might see this. Here's a whole series of books listed at a very familiar online retailer, all named 5 smooth stones. So that figure of speech in English has really taken hold, even though David, of course, as we all know, only has to use 1 stone. Let's look a little more closely at the language of this. He took his staff here. Machlav here is the word for staff, and as alter notes, he doesn't use it. It's the same word that Philistine uses as sticks later. And an important point here that will be made in the TED Talk by Malcolm Gladwell is that the narrator says his staff singular, but the Philistine will say sticks plural, and that raises a question about the Philistine's eyesight, at least in Gladwell's mind. So he took his staff in his hand, and this is the hand theme that I also highlighted just in bold here. So I went back the verse to the one we looked at last time in verse 37, and saw all the hand elements, and we're going to see that more as we go through. Both throughout the chiasm we see elements of hand here. So he took the staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones. And the word for smooth here, not the word for 5 or stones, which are common words, but the word for smooth here, hamashah, only here in the Masoretic text. And what one might ask, although it's unanswerable, there are a number of words in this chapter, as I've been pointing out, we'll point out more, that are either unique in the Bible, unique in 1 Samuel, or unique in the Deuteronomistic history. And so we can't draw the broad conclusion I'm just going to suggest. But perhaps because these 5 smooth stones are so famous, it uses a unique word, just as the burning bush that Moses finds Yahweh at and meets God as Yahweh is a unique word. So perhaps these authors using a special word to highlight there are no more 5 smooth stones or no more smooth stones in the Bible. This is a special case. But we can't know that. All we can know is that the word is unique here. And he pulls them out from the wadi, which is to say the dry riverbed, and put them in his shepherd's bag in the pouch, which is an odd phrase here. The last word you can see here is also only here in the Masoretic text. Curiously, the Septuagint, which translates this section, also uses unusual words which don't even have definitions in the Louw-Nida lexicon. And so unusual words here for the shepherd's bag in the pouch, which seems to be telling us more detail than we know. He's obviously not going to be hiding them away. They're going to be obviously right there. And his sling was in his hand. And I showed a picture of a sling before, a little video, and so you can go back to the earlier reference to that if you like. We can also just see it right here. Let's just show it right here so you can see it again. So that's the power of a slinger, and we saw that the sling is mentioned in the Bible in Judges, and we saw there that it said that the slingers, the left-handed slingers from Benjamin, which means son of the left, could hit a hare with a sling. And so it seems like in the face of the foreign armor and weapons of Goliath, David is picking up something perhaps more indigenous, but not quite so, because if we look at the Iliad, we see ironically here that the Greeks use slings too, and so we see in this brief passage from the Iliad here. He ceased, whom Hector heard with joy. He moved into the middle space, and with his spear advanced athwart, pushed back the Trojan van, and all stood fast. Meantime at him the Greeks discharged full volleys, showering thick around from bow and sling. And so the sling would have been well familiar, which is to say David is not sneaking up on Goliath as if he's never seen a sling before. He almost certainly has, unless his eyesight is bad, as Gladwell suggests. And Gladwell is basing it on the fact that if we think of his height as a biological condition based on something that might be putting pressure on his optical nerve, that his eyesight might be weakened. But that's taking too biologically literally, I would suggest, a description which is more like folklorish to say that these people are just giants without trying to attribute a modern medical causation of that. So his sling in his hand and a staff in his hand, and it seems like you can't use a sling with one hand. You have to be able to at least reach in your pouch and take the stone out. So he's got to put something down. But as Alter noted, the staff is a decoy. And he drew near to the Philistine. And so perhaps you can hear the music rising here as they come closer to each other. But David's not going to draw too near because we already know his strategy is to keep at some distance. The Philistines' plan, as Gladwell expresses so clearly, is that David come to him. He's expressing that this is not just single combat, but hand-to-hand combat. And that's what we will hear him suggest directly. So we move into verse 41 here, and this verse is not in the Septuagint. That's the one that I just highlighted a minute ago in bold. So if you're just reading the Greek, you wouldn't have this verse here. The Philistine came on and drew near to him, and that's highlighting that sense of the hand-to-hand combat. Again, with his shield bearer, which is over-translating, it doesn't have to be shield bearer. We've seen it earlier. It could just simply be his assistant. And as Gladwell suggested, an assistant to help him see, but that's not specified here. But the Philistines' vision is exactly what's at issue here. When the Philistines look and saw David, which as my note here highlights, we've seen from Falkman, we saw the reverse earlier. As the giant's appearance already known to us is shown through the eyes of the youth in verse 23, so verse 42b reflects the figure of David in the eyes of the giant. So he looks at him, he disdains him, or despises him, as another translation of that word, for he was only a youth. This isn't the same as describing Goliath's youth, as we saw that Saul said that he'd been a warrior since his youth. This is the same thing as describing David that we saw earlier as a nar, just a child. So he feels like you've just set a child to do a man's job. And as I was suggesting last time from the parallel from Isaiah 11, perhaps that's a little bit of what Isaiah had in mind when saying a little child will lead the reconciled natural world as well as the reconciled human world. Ruddy and handsome in appearance, echoing 16:12, and that raises the question again of whether one text knows the other. If this text is later, he could certainly be borrowing a verse from an earlier text to try to harmonize it, but we don't know that. So what Goliath sees that he's reddish and beautiful, and you see in my note below the various people in the Deuteronomistic history that are described as beautiful, but beauty is something that humans look on and not what God looks on. And here the Philistine sees it, and he disdains it. You sent me a pretty boy when you should have sent a warrior. And that's not what Philistine responds when he responds. He says, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And there's a certain irony in that, because when David said to Saul that he thought he could take on Philistine, he said the Philistine will be like a lion or a bear. In other words, he'd be like an animal that David could take on rather than a human. And the Philistine, not realizing that, of course, walks right into that you see me as an animal, that you come at me with sticks. And the sticks part is where Gladwell suggested the eyesight question. And the Philistine cursed David by his God. The word qual here in the qual, the everyday active use of it, can mean to make small. Here in the PL it can mean curse, but perhaps it carries that double irony. The giant has David look small by his gods. And we saw Dagon earlier, and this recalls the parody of Dagon that lost its head and its feet and fell down. And so as Dagon loses his head, so Goliath will lose his head. And that assumes, again, that the audience knows 1 Samuel 5. So just continuing down a few more verses before we stop for today. And so we're fully into the C center section of the chiasm here, and the Philistines part of it. As we noted last time with the Saul said to David and David said to Saul and then this David said, there's no specific reason here for the narrator or the writer to have the Philistine said to David twice, 2 verses in a row. He was plainly just speaking straight through, which suggests that these are like pull quotes or greatest hits, you will, that he'd been speaking for a while. He said this, and at some time later he said this, rather than that it's just continuous. So he said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the field. That's a phrase that we see a number of times in the Bible, and we see references here from Jeremiah and Ezekiel here. But it's to suggest, obviously, a humiliating kind of death. And now we see David's response. And so let's scroll down so we can see all of David's response here. So David said to the Philistine, you come to me with sword and spear and javelin. And I won't look at the note down below about that, which has a pattern that we're just not going to look at right now. But I come to you in the name of Yahweh of hosts, which is, say, Yahweh Sabaoth of armies, the God of the armies of Israel here. And the God of the armies of Israel is only here in the Bible, as Samura notes, in contrast with Yahweh's own heavenly armies implied by Sebaoth, the host. So it's equating Yahweh of hosts, which is to say the heavenly army, with a God of the armies of Israel, that the God who would be on the side of the human being's army rather than the heavenly army. Notice this is all just his divine claim. There's nothing in the text that's saying Yahweh actually is on this side so far. Whom you have defied. And of course, the defying was Goliath's own word and one of the key words in this chapter, as you can see from my note there. So David continues, this very day, and this is part of the internal chiasm, he repeats that twice, this very day Yahweh will deliver you into my hand. And it's an unusual word here for deliver. It's not the most common word for deliver, which is Yeshua, from which Joshua and Jesus, that Yahweh saves and delivers. So unusual word for that. And I will strike you down and cut off your head and give the dead bodies of the Philistine army, not just your body, but the entire Philistine army, this day to the birds of the air and the wild animals of the earth. Notice how he shifts from Goliath, the wild animals of the field, to the wild animals of the earth. The animals of the field would be like the domestic animals, and the wild animals of the earth is all animals. So that all the earth may know there is a God in Israel. So David's framing of this is not about him, and not even about a war as such, but about God, about Yahweh and a God in Israel, as if the only purpose of this was to show God's power. And that certainly is a way many people have read that what a stalwart David is for Yahweh. But as 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel continue, we'll have to question our initial understanding of that as we see more about the character of David. And so we get down near the end here in verse 47. And David implicitly undermines the divine authority of his later use of the sword and spear, which he will have. So as we read this, keep that in mind. So that all this assembly, and we notice that Zeh has been used negatively otherwise, and Poulsen suggests that's to upbraid the assembly for their lack of faith, who've been just terrified, as we've seen, along with their king. So this assembly, quahal, which is a normal word for the collection of the people of Israel, but rarely used in the Deuteronomistic history here, only here in 1st and 2nd Samuel, but very common in other parts of the Bible. Perhaps at this point, because they weren't gathering in that way, they were gathering as a nation under a king when they gather in the Deuteronomistic history, rather than gathering as local communities. So all this assembly may know that Yahweh does not save by sword and spear. Here's the more common term. For the battle is the Lord's, and notice not Yahweh here, and he will give you into our hand. Notice the our. So he's trying to make that collective, even though it's been about I will give and I will do. Now it's into our hands. So he's plainly making about the Philistines versus the Israelites rather than just the Philistine against him. And we know where the battle's going to go, but we'll look at that next time. See you then for that. Bye-bye.